The mountain of Zandalwana in eastern South Africa. On the 22nd of January 1879, this was the site of one of the most humiliating defeats ever suffered by the British Army. In just 3 hours, over 1,200 British troops, armed with state-of-the-art weapons, were annihilated by an African army equipped only with spears, shields, and a collection of old muskets. The enemy responsible captured the British imagination and went down in history as one of the most fearsome and powerful kingdoms in Africa, the Zulu. We know less about Africa's past than almost anywhere else on Earth. But the scarcity of written records doesn't mean Africa lacks history. In this series, I'm exploring some of the richest and most vibrant histories in the world. I'm traveling across South Africa through some of the country's most spectacular landscapes to discover how a tiny ethnic group born in a period of turmoil could become one of the most famous and celebrated kingdoms in history. Every February, a few thousand people gather to celebrate contemporary Zulu identity by taking part in a traditional South African ceremony. This First Fruits Festival is dedicated to the small yellow marula fruit native to the country. The crowds have come here to present the first harvest of the marula to their leader, King Goodwill Zwelithini. According to tradition, the king must be the first to taste the fruit before the people can harvest their crops. What's happening here is more than just a celebration of Zulu culture. It's an affirmation of the power of the king who's the embodiment of the state, and a connection to the great monarchs that founded the Zulu Nation. Zulu identity was shaped by a series of powerful kings. According to oral tradition, the original Zulu chiefdom was established in the 17th century by the founding patriarch, Malandela. It was his son Zulu who gave his name to the people. Zulu means heaven. They became known as the Amazulu, the people of heaven. They settled in a region that would eventually become known as KwaZulu-Natal. Bounded by the Drakensberg Mountains in the west and the Indian Ocean in the east, it's a landscape of rolling hills, deep river gorges, and fertile grasslands. I do love this bit of South Africa, KwaZulu-Natal. There's something about it that feels very authentic. I mean, so much of South Africa is so like Europe, but this feels really like Africa. At the end of the 18th century, the Zulu were just one of a patchwork of small chiefdoms that occupied this region. For over 100 years, they'd lived in relative peace, raising cattle and cultivating their fields. But then, everything began to change. Trade was the catalyst for the transformation of the Zulu people from a small local chiefdom into a major regional power. Europeans had been trading in southern Africa since the 16th century. On the west coast, the Dutch and later the British controlled the city of Cape Town, while closer to Zulu territory, the Portuguese had a trading post at Delagoa Bay. In exchange for ivory, cattle and slaves, the Portuguese and other European traders supplied copper, brass, textiles and beads. But trouble was brewing. By the end of the 18th century, rival ethnic groups were competing more and more aggressively for access to trade routes that linked to Delagoa Bay. Trade with the Portuguese was vital for local power and influence, but not everyone would get access. Small chieftains were in danger of being crushed by their larger rivals in the fight for goods to trade with the Europeans. The small Zulu chieftain was suddenly vulnerable. But out of that turmoil would emerge a man who would change Zulu history forever. His name, Shaka. Shaka was a king and a soldier and the founder of the Zulu Nation. In the space of 12 years, in the early 19th century, he transformed the small Zulu chiefdom into a large and powerful military force. Although he became an icon of the Zulu people, Shaka's legacy remains deeply contentious, something not helped by the myths that surround his biography.
What's really frustrating about Shaka's life is that there are hardly any contemporaneous written records. We have to rely on second-hand written material and oral testimonies, most of which is conflicting.
The lack of reliable evidence has left room for multiple interpretations of Shaka, many of them highly romanticized. Respected sources suggest he was born in the 1780s, the eldest son of a Zulu chief. For reasons unknown, he was raised in a neighbouring chiefdom, where he learned the skills of statecraft and soldiering. As inter-ethnic conflict erupted, he returned to the Zulus, seized the chieftaincy, and transformed the lives of his people. One legend portrays Shaka as a benevolent patriarch. As a young man, he is said to have worked as a herdsman. One day, he was out in the fields when he was distracted. As a result, he lost his herd. The shame he felt had a profound effect according to the story. Shaka learned from his early experience as a herdsman that it was important to look after every single member of your flock. He spent the rest of his life trying to compensate, making sure that security and discipline were the central focus of Zulu life. To explore one view of how Shaka built the Zulu Kingdom, I'm meeting Makawi Biela, a descendant of Shaka himself.
Before Shaka, there was no Zulu Empire. Shaka, through his intelligence, is the one who created the Zulu Empire. After he came to the throne, he said, okay, now what I'm going to do, I will go from clan to clan. Chieftain, I will approach each and every chief, and I will just unite people using the spear. I united them in order for me to establish the great Zulu Empire.
But were people scared of him, or did they respect him, or was it a mixture of the two?
Mixture of the two. Some feared him, because for those who refused to join his faction, you know, they knew very well what would happen to them.
Yeah.
A spear would be put into use. There are so many other people who said, no, we cannot tolerate this. We cannot live under your control.
But there must have been good reasons why people stayed within the Zulu Nation. What was so attractive about the Zulu state that Shaka was building? What were the wonderful things that he was giving to the people that they didn't have before?
Well, the thing that people never had, they were not united. They were like having small clans here and there. He was emphasizing unity. No separation, no isolation, no quarrel, nothing. He is trying to unite the people. He's trying to create our identity as Zulu people.
Many Zulu today venerate Shaka as the protector and defender of the people. They give him credit for reforming an institution that shaped Zulu identity and transformed its fortunes, the army. These warriors are members of a ceremonial Zulu regiment. Today, they perform on formal occasions, but in Shaka's time, regiments were the backbone of Zulu society.
When Shaka assumed the throne in 1816, he decided to build upon recent innovations of local chiefs. He introduced a system of conscription, divided his soldiers into regiments called amabutu, and these were to revolutionize Zulu society.
Under the amabutu system, young men left their families around the age of 14 to work and fight in regiments. Separating young men from the rest of Zulu society was a way of shifting their loyalty from local chiefs to their amabutu and their king. One of the leaders of the regiment is Ungamizi.
For the start, ibutho manga bukhula umncane uthatha uqala ukubheka ukuthi ungaba insizwa ukhona lokho okuthiwa ngamabutho onqabe embube ekhipha inkunzi ofela phakathi kanjalo niyabuthwa ukubuthwa kwenu lapho nisuke nenzela ukumela ubuntu benu noma umela isizulu njoba singakwazi sinamagama ethu njengokuthi mina ngizalwe kunye nawe kodwa sibuthwe kanye kuthiwe siyinqabe embube ukhipha inkunzi umanukelana ufela phakathi kwakubuthwa for the start.
To the military system, it's actually part of the culture, and the culture is part of the military system, that in a way it's absolutely fundamental to Zulu culture.
Yes.
Under Shaka, young men in the amabutu were not allowed to marry and set up their own homesteads. Marriage rights could only be earned once soldiers had reached maturity and distinguished themselves in battle, normally around the age of 35. By making marriage a reward for military service, Shaka ensured the loyalty of his men. Shaka's also credited with introducing new fighting techniques, including a new battle formation that proved brilliantly effective. It became known as the Horns of the Buffalo.
Simon, can you tell me about the battle formation that the Zulu used?
Regiment leader Simon is giving me a demonstration.
So this is the enemy here. How would the Horns of the Buffalo actually work? If that was the enemy that was approaching the Zulu lines, how would it...
Can I draw it down?
Yeah, please do.
Yes. The buffalo horn shape, it's like this.
What, they would engage with this group here? Is that
This is the chest
This is the chest
of warriors, where the very strong and the strongest men used to stand. All these young stars, all this round left and right, they surround an enemy, and then the enemy will be in the middle now. They will kill him dead.
To illustrate the battle technique more clearly, Simon's arranging his warriors into the attack formation.
What happens? Eat. This is what I'm talking about.
So this is the strategy that Shaka actually invented, that they would form the horns of a buffalo.
Yes.
At the actual head are the strongest men.
Yes.
And that they would hit the enemy really hard.
Hit the enemy really hard.
And then whilst the enemy's trying to deal with these big guys, the two horns come round and they enclose you.
Yes.
And they finish you off.
They finish off. This is how he conquered so many tribes. Wow. And make it one big tribe, Zulu Nation.
So they're actually singing, "We are the bull, but we will destroy you." I mean, that metaphor of cattle, it's obviously so deeply infused into the Zulu. And it's just amazing to see it brought to life in these kinds of performances.
Shaka also transformed Zulu weaponry, preferring a short-handled stabbing spear, used like a dagger, to the older long-handled throwing spear.
What is so much better about this than what went before? Why is this such a good piece of weaponry?
Before they've used the long spears. When they just throw these long spears like that, it was a waste of energy, because once they throw, missing an enemy, the enemy will take those spears and face you again. It was a waste. Now that's why Shaka invented this.
Money where your mouth is, Simon. Okay,
Yes.
you ready for this?
Yes, I'm ready.
Shaka's warriors were instructed to fight their enemies to the death. If they lost their spears, they weren't only vulnerable to the enemy, they were treated by their own leaders as cowards.
This short spear is your life. If you lose your short spear, you're dead. What you can say? Where is your spear? You lost it running? Huh? You must be taken to the place called Kwankata.
What would happen to you at Kwankata?
If someone have done wrong, like you lost this short spear, that's a serious case. You'll be taken by the very strong man. You'll be struck in the head, dead. In that place, always the vultures are turning around that place. As soon as you have been killed, the vultures will get into you, take some eyes out, and you know, that's how it is.
With the creation of his powerful army, Shaka had transformed the Zulu people from a small chiefdom into a powerful militaristic state. The army became the focus of Zulu life. And as chiefdoms started fighting each other for access to the trade routes, Shaka's soldiers prepared for conflict. The early Zulu Kingdom wasn't like a European kingdom with palaces, crown jewels and a civil service. Rather, it was a web of small communities, ruled by the king through a network of local chiefs. It was these communities that Shaka's army was defending. They lived in clusters of small houses whose layout has changed little since King Shaka's time. This is in Kandla Valley, in the heart of KwaZulu-Natal.
This whole area is peppered with traditional Zulu homesteads, and I'm about to visit one.
While the designs have changed over the years, the homestead remains the focal point of Zulu society. I've been invited to meet the lady who lives here.
Hello? What a welcome. Nice to meet you.
Oh, yindlulela ngane yami. Nazi ezini, nazi kwagogo, kwamkhulu, kwadodana. Kwamdodana, kwagogo, isibaya senkomo, tabamlisi.
It's a beautiful place you have here. How many people live in a homestead of this size?
Awu. Bayisithupha. Kodwa lezi ezinye izindlu abangasekho abantu. Sekuyizindlu zami. Yes. Bayisithupha bakhona. Ukuba nyoyenzike kuphunguka likhaya.
The layout of the homestead reflects the structure of Zulu society as a whole.
Oh, how beautiful. You just look at this.
Zulu culture was patriarchal and polygamous. Each house in the homestead functioned like an individual room, with the married man's house at the rear, surrounded on both sides by those of his wives, children, and extended family. This domestic structure was the same throughout Zulu society, making the homestead the smallest building block of Shaka's empire. And at the centre of the homestead is its most important feature.
This is a traditional Zulu cattle corral, and they were usually placed right in the centre of a Zulu village, and that was partially for security, but it's also a measure of the importance of cattle. They are the central focus of Zulu society. They were actually used as part of the Zulu economy, and they were also used for bartering.
Traditionally, a man who wished to marry had to provide his bride's father with a gift of cattle to compensate him for the loss of his daughter. And distribution of cattle was both a source of conflict and one of the ways in which warring factions made peace. Only men were allowed in the cattle pen, and the pen itself had a spiritual status within the homestead. The circular shape of both the cattle pen and the homestead is not an accident. It's a design that's both protective and defensive, embodying the promise of security and belonging, upon which the Zulu Kingdom was founded. But for Shaka, it wasn't enough just to protect his own people. The Zulu were just one of a number of chiefdoms competing for power in a period of turmoil. For many, it was a case of conquer or be conquered. With his powerful new army, Shaka was able to set about turning his Zulu chiefdom into an empire.
For 4 years, Shaka then embarked on a period of aggressive regional expansion. He annihilated his enemies and forced people off of their land. It was a period that became known as Umfakane, the crushing.
Shaka built the Zulu Nation by conquering these chiefdoms and incorporating them into the larger Zulu Kingdom. Those who refused to cooperate had two options: death or exile. As the Zulu Kingdom expanded southward, many fled to the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains on the fringes of Zulu territory. Here in this remote landscape, archaeologist Benjamin Smith has traced the impact of Shaka's conquests.
This is on the periphery of the Mfecane main area, and what happened is that many groups were sort of fled the Mfecane and came out into the mountains as places of refuge to get away from sort of Zulu imperialism and the domination of the Zulu royal family. And so chiefs that wanted to still retain independence, or that were kicked out for some reason or another, ended up in these kind of areas. And they would come here for security and safety, and to get away from the things that are happening down in the main sort of centre of Mfecane activity.
But before the refugees of warfare came here, this region was already inhabited. It was home to hunter-gatherers known as the Sand People. Hardly any traces of the Mfecane remain, but one remarkable piece of evidence survives. Benjamin's taking me to see a tiny fragment of a sand rock painting depicting a warrior, perhaps a refugee from Shaka's conquests.
Okay, so here we are. There is the great painting of a man carrying a shield.
Beautiful.
Probably painted in the 1810s or reflecting on things from 1810, 1820, exactly the time of the Mfecane.
What are we actually seeing here, Benjamin?
You can see here a human figure, back leg, front leg. In his left arm, you can see a long spear with a long metal tip. In his right arm, he's holding this slightly exaggerated shield. And what's noticeable about it is not the classic Zulu shape, sort of lozenge, but it's slightly indented in the middle. And one of the things that we recognise now is that this is not a typical Zulu shield. It's probably someone escaping from the Zulu Kingdom and coming into no man's land as a place of refuge.
So the person who created this may well have lived in the period of Shaka?
Very, very likely. One of these groups that's fleeing from the direct rule and sort of might of Shaka.
The Mfecane transformed southern Africa. It was swift and uncompromising. And as a result, the Zulu Nation expanded from around 3,000 people to over 250,000. For those who didn't resist, Shaka offered security, a collective identity, and the promise of a future for their children. But around the Zulu Kingdom, southern Africa was changing. In 1824, a group of British traders landed in a small lagoon on the east coast of southern Africa. Today it's Durban, the largest city of KwaZulu-Natal. The traders established a base and quickly made contact with King Shaka. Their arrival would have profound consequences for the Zulu Kingdom.
This is Francis Farewell Square, the location of Britain's first trading post in Natal. From a collection of huts on this site, Britain traded with the Zulu in textiles and metals, and they exchanged those goods for animal hides and ivory. And those first traders' accounts would shape the reputation of Shaka for decades.
Shaka continues to be remembered by many Zulus as an heroic warrior statesman whose military conquest created a proud nation. But 19th century British accounts of Shaka offer a darker view. They wrote of a brutal despot who maintained internal control by terrorizing his own people. While these accounts of Shaka as savage may well have been an alibi for Britain's colonial ambitions, they cast a long shadow over his reputation. To explore that legacy, I'm visiting the Killy Campbell Library to meet historian Siyabonga Mkhize. In the early 20th century, a British colonial official named James Stewart recorded oral testimonies from Zulu elders, many of them first or second-hand accounts of Shaka's life. They provide some of the most important historical evidence of Shaka's biography. Siyabonga, could you explain to me a little bit about James Stewart and his archive?
Yeah, most of the informants of James Stewart were people who have seen Shaka, or people that have seen people that were living during Shaka's time. For example, if you can find that, we go to the information that was given by Balega. Balega was a man from the Kwabe clan.
Shaka did many evil things to people. Seeing a woman who was pregnant, though she had done him no harm, he ordered her to be caught, killed and cut open, so that it could be seen in what position her child was lying. Gosh. It's shocking. I mean, are there other negative accounts? I mean, just interested in getting that, to find out that side of him.
If you can check to this page 10, you find Balega here still talking about King Shaka.
Balega says that Shaka once asked a woman who was drawing water in an earthen pot at a stream for a drink of water. The woman, not knowing Shaka, said, "Why don't you lap up the water as the other dogs do?" thereby refusing him the drink. Shaka marked her down. He then directed that she was to be put to death in order that he might see what kind of heart so inhospitable a person had. Wow. Sounds like quite a ruthless picture of almost a despot.
It might be true. It might be true. It might not be true, because during Shaka's time, people were making a lot of stories about him. Those stories were constructed by different people because they wanted to find so that others to believe that I've seen Shaka or I've been in Shaka's court. Then people will tell a lot of lies.
But it seems like Balega is not a fan of Shaka, whichever way we cut it, that these are a variety of fairly awful things that Balega feels that Shaka has done. But are there views then, by contrast, that are very positive?
Yes, here, Janji. He talks about Shaka as a good character or as a good king.
My father said Shaka was a great king and
Yes.
very clever because he defeated all the chiefs in every direction.
Yes.
He was very resourceful.
You remember that clans were living independently all over the country. Then he managed to defeat them and make them one nation.
I found that really fascinating. There's obviously a broad range of different interpretations of Shaka. But you know this material probably better than anyone. I mean, who do you feel Shaka was, and how do you feel about him?
If I can say, let's bring back Shaka now, he can make a good politician. For me, that's how I see Shaka. It was just a game of the day that he could kill other people to get what he wanted to get. But he was a great politician.
Shaka died in 1828, in his early 40s. He'd been assassinated by his half-brothers, who seized the Zulu throne.
As happens so often with historical research, when you get close to the subject, they seem almost to dissolve in ambiguity. I mean, Shaka is a very complicated man, that he's part despotic leader, but at the same time, he's a very charismatic individual who transforms Zulu society. And one has to think that he left huge shoes to fill. The legacy of this man is enormous.
Shaka's death marked a break with the past. His successor, King Dingaan, decided to build a new royal residence in the heart of Zulu territory, the Amakasini Valley. This is Ngunganklovu, the site of Dingaan's royal compound. When it was built in 1829, this compound would have contained around 1,500 small beehive-shaped houses, clustered 8 deep around a central cattle pen. Between 5,000 and 7,000 people lived on this site. When Dingaan seized control of the Zulu throne, he took control of a nation at its absolute zenith. During his 12 years of rule, Shaka had expanded Zulu territory from 10 square miles to over 12,000. He left a standing army of more than 40,000 men and ruled over a population of more than 250,000 people. But the Zulu faced a new threat, and that was to come to a head here. Beginning in 1836, groups of Boer settlers, descendants of Dutch, German and French farmers, set off from the Cape Colony in search of new land. Their leader was Piet Retief. In late 1837, they arrived in Zulu territory. After a series of skirmishes, Dingaan agreed to give them land in exchange for cattle. To seal the deal, some 70 Boer farmers travelled to Dingaan's royal residence.
The Boers' arrival was provocative. They rode into the royal enclosure on horseback, firing their weapons. It was a display that Dingaan interpreted as insulting and aggressive.
Before their departure, the Boers were invited to Dingaan's homestead for a final leave-taking. As was traditional, they were asked to leave their weapons outside.
Whilst 2 Zulu regiments did a ceremonial dance, Dingaan stood up and he shouted, "Seize the wizards!" And the Boer were taken away, and one by one they were clubbed to death.
The Boers were executed on a hill just outside the Royal Zulu compound. Their leader, Piet Retief, was forced to witness their deaths. He was the last to die. The 70 Boers were buried on this site.
The manner of the Boers' deaths only helped to reinforce their view that the Zulu were treacherous and barbaric. This was an act that would be avenged.
9 months after the massacre of the Boers, their compatriots appointed a new leader, Andries Pretorius. He organised a commando of 470 Boers to take the fight to the Zulu. By the 15th of December, 1838, the Boer party had advanced towards the banks of the Nkome River. They halted their wagons and set up camp, today commemorated by this monument on the spot. What happened next would become a turning point in Zulu history.
The Boers developed a defensive strategy for dealing with attacks from the indigenous population that they encountered on their treks. They'd circle wagons and place between them wooden fences and pack these spaces with straw. This allowed for a large space in the centre in which they could protect their families and their livestock. They called this a laager.
The Zulus attacked at dawn, but the Boers' improvised fortification gave them a crucial tactical advantage. The circular shape of the laager meant the Zulus had no clear point of attack. In their confusion, the Zulus made a crucial tactical error. The left horn of the Zulu army attacked before the chest or the right horn were ready. They came under sustained Boer gunfire, and they were forced to retreat, and many of them ended up in the river. The Boers advanced and fired down onto the Zulus massing in the riverbed. The Zulu were unable to engage in close combat with their short spears. Around 3,000 Zulus were killed. Their bodies filled the riverbed and turned the water red. The battle became known as Blood River. Historian Ken Gillings has studied the impact of Blood River on the Zulu.
So Ken, what were the consequences of the loss here at Blood River?
For the first time, the Zulu had now come up against a Western method of fighting, if you like. Volley fire, gunfire. No longer was there that close combat which they were so used to and which they were successful with against indigenous opponents, if you like.
So the precedent, the potential vulnerability of the Zulu strategy, it was actually here at Blood River that was actually found out.
Yes.
They were found wanting.
That's correct. Because the traditional method of Zulu attack was one of close combat. And here, it was a fortified position. And it was simply impossible for them, with the weaponry at their disposal, to break into a defensive position such as this.
The defeat at Blood River split the Zulu Kingdom in two and plunged it into civil war. 3 decades of instability followed. The Zulu were only just recovering when an event 800 miles away, deep in Boer territory, destabilized the Zulu Kingdom even further. In 1871, a labourer on a farm near the modern town of Kimberley discovered a small white stone that caused an international sensation. Within 2 years, tens of thousands of people had descended on the area to seek their fortunes. And this is what they came for. The De Beer brothers became the luckiest farmers in history, and their land became the largest diamond mine in the world. By the mid-1870s, the town of Kimberley had become the African equivalent of the Klondike. Filled with prospectors, speculators, powerful European financiers. Together with vast amounts of gold discovered in the 1880s, diamonds would transform South Africa. This is the Big Hole, the site of the original De Beers diamond mines. Before it was exhausted, the mine was excavated to a depth of 1,097 meters. The first 240 meters were dug by hand with picks and shovels, making this one of the world's biggest man-made excavations. It also meant to accomplish this, the mine owners developed a near insatiable need for one thing: labour. They turned to local African men, but here they encountered a problem. The increasingly complex mining operations required a consistent labour force. But African workers, many from traditional chiefdoms, tended to work in the mines for short periods and then return home, leaving their employers in the lurch. To control their black labour force, the mine owners introduced barrack-style compounds. Migrant workers had to sign up to 6-month contracts, during which they were forced to live in the compounds, surrendering all personal freedoms. The impact on the traditional way of life was devastating. Young men who'd only ever experienced a barter economy suddenly had cash in their pockets. Ancient cultures that had endured for generations were suddenly under attack. Although Kimberley was 800 miles from Zulu territory, a number of Zulu men ended up working on the diamond fields. The Mcgregor Museum in Kimberley holds a remarkable collection of photographs of those Zulu migrant workers dating from the early 20th century. They were taken by a compound guard and amateur photographer, Alfred Duggan Cronin. Robert Hart is the curator.
So here's one of Duggan Cronin's original photograph albums.
Rather than photograph the Zulu workers in their mining clothes, Duggan Cronin encouraged them to dress in their traditional costumes and pose in elaborate tableaux.
He took some quite startling photographs. For example, this one, which he's called a Zulu MP on the march, but it's these mine workers in their traditional dress on a mine dump. Here's another study. This is a portrait of a Zulu warrior. The man's in his traditional attire.
He's obviously a very good photographer. They are beautiful things.
Yes, here's another one. Instructions from the chief, and they Zulu scouts. Again, the most startling thing is the mine dump in the background. And on the part of the mine owners, there was a curiosity for the other. They used to take visitors to see them on Sundays, and they used to actually ask them to dress up, and then they would do these war dances.
But it is a bit like animals in the zoo. For these people who were so fiercely independent, for them to then see their identity becoming something which is just worthy of being photographed or captured by people on a Sunday afternoon as something that's exotic and wonderful. And it must have been humiliating at some level.
It must have, because to be reduced to a sort of curiosity.
Yes. It's a sad story, but beautifully illustrated.
The colonial mindset that viewed the Zulu as an exotic curiosity contributed to what happened next. Before the discovery of diamonds, South Africa was an economic backwater. Now it was a source of untold wealth. At the end of the 1870s, the lands that contained such abundant mineral resources were located in a patchwork of independent Boer, British and African-controlled territories. With so much money at stake, and with other European powers scrambling for a piece of the action, it was a situation the British authorities were keen to regularise. And so they hatched a plan. By drawing the different states of South Africa into a single British-controlled territory, the British hoped to consolidate their power, develop the economy, and suppress the growing resistance from African chiefdoms. among them the Zulu. In 1878, a number of minor Zulu infringements on the border of the colony of Natal were cited by the British authorities as evidence of the Zulu Kingdom's aggressive intentions. The British mischievously hinted that a Zulu invasion of Natal was imminent. And so, on the 11th of December 1878, under a fig tree on the banks of the Tugela River, the Zulu were issued with an ultimatum. The ultimatum comprised a number of key demands: the end of the Zulu army, the dismantling of the old regiment system, and the presence of a colonial administrator deep in the heart of Zulu territory. Effectively, these would have combined to mean the end of the Zulu Empire. The new leader of the Zulu Nation was Cetshwayo. He'd become king in 1872. During his reign, he'd built relationships with the British and reunified the Zulu Nation after decades of trauma and infighting. By 1878, only a small number of Zulu men had gone to work on the diamond fields. The Zulu Kingdom was once again a powerful military force. King Cetshwayo was not about to give away his empire without a fight. On the 11th of January 1879, 3 columns of British soldiers, led by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford, moved into Zululand. The invasion force consisted of around 12,000 men, made up of British soldiers and African support troops. On the 20th of January, the central column set up camp deep inside Zulu territory. They chose a wide expanse of land beneath a rocky outcrop named Zandalwana. The British troops remarked that the distinctive mountain resembled the Egyptian Sphinx. Lord Chelmsford believed the Zulu would employ guerrilla tactics rather than engage in a single large battle, so he decided to take the fight to them. But he was mistaken. In what can only be described as a catastrophic mistake, Lord Chelmsford decided to split his troops, leading the bulk of his men down through that V in the mountains, right deep into Zulu territory. But what he didn't know, at that very moment, massing on the other side of those adjacent mountains were 20,000 Zulu troops. Later that morning, a British patrol was out on the hills close to Zandalwana. They came over a ridge and saw an astonishing sight. Thousands of Zulu warriors sitting on the ground in complete silence. With the main body of the British Army many miles away, the troops at the base camp were dangerously exposed. When the Zulus spotted the British patrol, they launched their attack. As the British started firing their weapons, the Zulu took on their traditional Horns of the Buffalo formation. The toughest troops in the chest took on the British infantry. The 2 horns spread out to fully surround the British positions. The Zulu descended in their thousands, using their short stabbing spears to attack the British in the hand-to-hand fighting style that King Shaka had favoured. The result was carnage. The British were completely overwhelmed and their camp was totally destroyed. Over 1,200 British and African support troops were killed. The white cairns that dot the battlefield at Zandalwana mark the burial places of the British soldiers. Lindizwe Ngobese is the great-great-grandson of one of the Zulu warriors who fought at Zandalwana. How does it make you feel, having that personal connection to what happened here?
It makes me feel proud. Here now, Zulus now, they are fighting within their kingdom, and also they are now aware that the British now, they want to do away with their kingdom. They do not want to lose it. Let's fight and die for it.
And do you feel that those people who died, that they died for something which was worthwhile?
I think so. That is the only Zulu kingdom we've got, nothing else. Losing this one, we've got nowhere to go. Today we're here, we're proud of what they did. It was not nice, but you know, they did it for those descendants. Today it's like this, we're very proud.
Many Zulu today celebrate the Zulu military and remember Zandalwana as the kingdom's finest hour. The Zulu Nation had been threatened with destruction, but its army had responded with focus and discipline. Their victory had embarrassed and shaken the British, but it was a victory that would be short-lived. Before the two horns of the Zulu army met and fully enveloped the British, a small band of survivors attempted to retreat. They were trying to make their way to a small British garrison and field hospital 8 miles away. It was known as Rorke's Drift. At the time, it was occupied by around 150 British troops.
The field hospital here at Rorke's Drift sits on the banks of the Buffalo River in what was then the British-run territory of Natal. Now, Cetshwayo had expressly forbidden his troops from entering the British colony, but in defiance of their king, 4,000 men, the men who made up the rump of the earlier battle formation at Isandlwana, entered this area with the express idea of attacking the hospital. This was going to be a repeat of their earlier victory.
The British realised there was no point in trying to flee. They barricaded themselves in and turned their buildings into a fortification. In the late afternoon, the Zulu attacked. They laid siege for over 5 hours and at one point actually broke through the British perimeter. But remarkably, the British prevailed.
With thousands of rounds of ammunition and state-of-the-art weapons, the British were able to see off the Zulu.
The Zulu withdrew, but not before over 500 of their men were killed. Rorke's Drift went down in history as a legendary British success. 11 of the soldiers who defended the site received Victoria Crosses for bravery, the highest number ever awarded to a regiment for a single battle. But an event that went down in history as a triumph for the British was a catastrophe for the Zulu.
Come and have a seat. It's a nice place to sit this and have a chat.
Rob Casky is an expert on the Battle of Rorke's Drift.
So Rob, why did the Zulu fail here at Rorke's Drift?
Well, there are a number of factors as to why they lost here at Rorke's Drift, Gus. The fact that it was a prepared defensive position, the fact that the Zulus were overconfident and didn't really have a battle plan as to how they would attack this place. And when the initial attacks were repulsed here, I think a huge amount of the fight was knocked out of the Zulu.
And what was the Zulus' attitude to modern weaponry?
The Zulus hitherto had not really come up against sustained modern firepower from rifles like the Martini Henry or the Gatling gun. And I don't think they really knew quite what to expect and just how devastating this weapon would be. I mean, at close range, it would kill 3 men in a line. And the Zulus up to that point hadn't faced weaponry of that power.
So what were the repercussions of Rorke's Drift for the Zulu? Obviously the repercussions continued to fold out over months and years.
Well, they did. The repercussions here were enormous. The Zulus, I think, realise now that the British would be almost impossible to attack if they were behind prepared positions. And the fact that they had crossed the Buffalo River into Natal gave the British reason to re-invade Zululand and to smash the Zulu order forever.
"5 months after Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, the British Army returned to Zululand, 25,000 strong. This time, they were determined to finish the job. After a series of battles, the decisive Anglo-Zulu clash came at the town of Ulundi, a few miles from Cetshwayo's royal compound. This monument marks the site of the battle. The British arranged their troops into a hollow square, firing out from all sides. It was the kind of fixed fortification that had proved so successful at Rorke's Drift.
The sweeping horns of the buffalo were no match to the British block formation, particularly when backed by serious artillery. The Zulu lost 1,500 men, the British by comparison 13. This was the end of the Zulu Empire.
Using a well-tried divide-and-rule strategy, the British sliced up the kingdom into 13 individual chieftaincies, each led by an enemy of King Cetshwayo. The kingdom was plunged into a bitter civil war in which more Zulus died than in the whole of the Anglo-Zulu conflict.
Cetshwayo was captured and imprisoned. He eventually made his way to England to plead his case to Queen Victoria, but he died in 1884. The glorious kingdom that Shaka had built had been systematically destroyed.
Despite the destruction of the independent Zulu Kingdom in the late 19th century, the Zulu Nation lives on. Though it is no longer a sovereign state with a standing army, the Zulu people remain the largest ethnic group in South Africa. Over the years, the Zulu military past has been glorified, interpreted, and used by different factions for their own political purposes, especially in South Africa's recent history. Sometimes the portrayal of Shaka and the Zulu past has obscured the truth, but it served to maintain Zulu pride.
The history of the Zulu could be read as one of defeat and disaster, but there's something else. There's a triumph against adversity. There's a sense of unity. Things which continue to bind and endure.
And The Lost Kingdoms continues next week. Next tonight on BBC4, lives changed forever by the outbreak of AIDS. San Francisco's Year Zero. We were here.